Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I am your host, Andrew Langer. And as I've been saying, if you're enjoying us on video, you can also check us out on podcast form, in MP3 form, on every major podcast platform. If you're listening to us, but you want to watch us and you want to see me interact with our guests directly, you can watch us on YouTube. Go check it out. I'm just asking, please recommend us to your friends and everybody you know. Leave a review. That certainly helps us grow this audience. Joining me today, very excited to have our guest on. His name is Gregory Angelo. He is the president of the New Tolerance Campaign, a relatively new organization itself. But I've known Greg for a long time. He brings more than a decade of nonprofit management and strategic communication success to the New Tolerance Campaign. By the way, Greg, I am, yes, of course, reading your bio because I don't have it
Hey, I'll take
memorized,
it.
so
I'll
I
take
apologize
it.
for that. No worries. Coupling an outsider mentality with insider knowledge, gleaned throughout a career spanning key senior leadership roles at grassroots advocacy organizations, Capitol Hill and the White House. No stranger to combating intolerance. As a longtime president of Log Cabin Republicans, Angelo regularly engaged with elected officials, public figures in the media to promote civil discourse between people of faith in the LGBTQ community. His contributions have been featured in newspapers around the world. He's been on the radio. He's been on television. And he just had a piece in the Wall Street Journal that I want to unpack. But let's start here with what the New Tolerance Campaign is, Greg.
100%. Number one, great to reconnect with you and to reconnect with you in this capacity. And the New Tolerance Campaign, as you mentioned, is a relatively nascent nonprofit. It was founded to push back on wokeism and cancel culture. But wokeism and cancel culture are really symptoms of the greater problem. And it's a problem that the New Tolerance Campaign seeks to address. And that specifically is the institutions whose double standards and hypocrisy have gotten us into this mess. And when I say institutions, I am talking about these woke corporations and their boards and their CEOs. I'm talking about the executive directors and trustees of activist nonprofits that, at least on paper, have noble missions, but have completely lost their way and are basically now just carrying water for the left. I'm looking at you, ACLU and Southern Poverty Law Center, among others. And then, of course, what I call the OGs when it comes to the hypocritical cancel culture institutions, and that is the colleges and universities around the country that continue their ever leftward drift, canceling speech, and doing the exact opposite of promoting civil discourse. Now, what makes us unique at the New Tolerance Campaign is that we represent the grassroots movement pushing back on all of that. I think for far too long, our side has not engaged in the same type of aggressive grassroots pressure campaigns and activism that the other side has. Incidentally, that's another reason these institutions have been corrupted. So we have taken the call your senator, email your congressman model and repurposed it and turned the turrets onto those institutions. And we allow everyday Americans to send messages directly to the CEO and board of directors of Walmart when they mandate critical race theory principle training among their employees. You can send messages directly to the deans of colleges and universities when they deplatform and decharter student organizations like the school's Turning Point USA chapter at Emerson, and then in one case like the Emory University Free Speech Forum, which we did help get rechartered at that school. So we have a couple of victories under our belt right now. I am under no illusions that this is going to happen overnight, but I also don't want to cede the culture war hill to the left. I think it's something that is still salvageable, and that's what we're working to do at New Tolerance.
Let's talk about talk about this from a substantive perspective. What does an America? It's not even what does an America look like if we can't talk to each other, but how does an America in which Americans can't talk to each other solve problems? Talk about that as one of the aspects of what the New Tolerance Campaign is all about.
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, I think we're already there. We're already at a point where people aren't talking, and it's not just that people aren't engaging with others that share different views than they are. What we're seeing is a a trend that has been emerging called self-silencing, where people make a point of not saying anything in public or to colleagues or to friends for fear that whatever they say is something that could get them in trouble, could get them canceled. They might even lose their job as a result. And so, people are lying. There's actually, there's been polling that's been done about this where people are, saying things that they don't believe just because they want the approval of their peers and their friends and their colleagues. But when they go home, they don't believe this. When they're in the voting booth, I would also add, they don't engage in that kind of self-silencing. So there's a disconnect between what we're actually hearing in the public square and what people are actually supportive of and what they oppose. And so, in that case, we're not going to get anywhere. There's actually no way to make any sort of progress in our society because there's no way to actually discuss and reach consensus on issues. We're kind of at a stalemate.
It's interesting because when I hear self-silencing, I think of the fact, I don't post political stuff to my personal Facebook page anymore. I save that for Twitter or elsewhere for a lot of these things. But what you're also talking about is what I consider to be kind of the magical incantation. I spent a lot of time talking about sort of one of the problems on the left being that both they are decoupling their policy objectives from any kind of objective reality, their policy goals from any objective reality, while at the same time engaging in magical thinking to kind of get us to think that they're gonna do the same stuff we did 50, 75 years ago in terms of socialism, but bring us a different result. But what we're talking about here is, one of the things during the summer of 2020, where we saw, you can call them riots, you can call them protests, but when you would have situations in which the Black Lives Matter movement would go and engage in marches through cities, they would surround people and make them engage in incantations of the magic words that they would have to say. Right. This is more of what you're talking about in terms of self-silencing, isn't it? It's engaging in that incantation when you don't believe that the witchcraft will produce anything.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that's where the mob mentality is taking us. At this point, it's not enough to not agree with the mob and to not say anything that might earn their ire. You are actually compelled to say things that you might not believe with, that you don't agree with, in order to just continue living your life in quiet dignity. What's the Eric Erickson quote? "You will be made to care." I think we are hitting that point, sadly, in our society where people are being made to care about a whole host of causes.
I may have said this before. I may have said that, Greg, before Eric Erickson said it, but who am I? I don't know. Listen, but you're right. I mean, it's a situation where Grover Norquist wrote a great book called "Leave Us Alone," and he talked about the conservo-libertarian movements as a "Leave Us Alone" coalition. We don't have to get into sort of where things change, and when you talk about what the role of government is in terms of protecting individual rights, but set that aside. The point is, it's a "Leave Us Alone" coalition. And then we've now moved into this era of "you will be made to care," right? For me, one of the starkest aspects of this was, it's 2016, 2017. I want to say it was late 2016. It was right before Mike Pence becomes vice president of the United States. He goes to see Hamilton in New York, and he is lectured at by the cast of Hamilton from the stage. And it's like, can't this guy just go out and enjoy what, I like the musical for the music, and I like the fact that it was historic. There are certain things that disagree. Anyway, the point is, can't this guy go out and enjoy what is, at that point, a cultural phenomenon without the folks purveying that phenomenon, lecturing him, hectoring him? This is what we're talking about, isn't it, Greg?
Yeah, and look, it's not even the fact that he was being lectured to, by the cast of Hamilton after the show. It's that there's no escape from politics anymore. Right? I mean, going to see a Broadway show, that was something that united people. It doesn't matter what your politics are. You can talk about seeing a fantastic performance, leaving the theater humming the songs from Phantom of the Opera or Les Miserables or whatever, or even Hamilton. I think we're seeing this right now also, in the case of Bud Light, where, you usually crack a beer open to unwind and get away from the politics and the intensity of the day. But more and more in America, we are seeing politics at every turn, and politics infesting every part of our lives. And, so coupled with the self-silencing, there's a degree of exhaustion, I think,
Right.
with all of this, but also a degree of frustration that the public has. I think that the silent majority is a real thing. It's something that I'm seeing at the New Tolerance campaign because when we're rallying voices together, we actually see that, there are tens of thousands of people around the country that are happy to lend their voice to a cause as long as they know other people are there to join them,
I'll give you a really good example. At least I think it's a good example, from my own world. Now, I love to cook. I'm a foodie. I've mentioned this before. We've had Chef Andrew Gruel on the show in the past. And I was, for many years, a devotee of, if you're a foodie and you cook, invariably you know about Penzeys Spices. Penzeys Spices is like the gold standard in terms of spice companies. And then in 2016, 2017, I think it was 2017, Bill Penzy comes out and he says, you know something? I hate Donald Trump. And if you're a Donald Trump supporter, I don't want you buying my spices. And I actually argued with Bill Penzy over this. I mean, I took some time and I emailed him and we went back and forth. And he literally, he had said this tacitly earlier, but to me directly he said, if you're a Trump supporter, I don't want your business. I'm like, okay, you know something? And interestingly enough, his sister had opened a few years earlier I don't know, maybe she couldn't stand her brother. She opened up her own spice company called the Spice Palace. Not political at all. The only color they care about is green. And, something I've ordered from them. I've even gone back and started using McCormick spices again. Good, solid Baltimore company that could care less about politics. But this is the point, right? Is you got Bill Penzy, and listen, Bill Penzy has a right to say this.
Sure.
And he has a right to, try it. I believe he has a fundamental right to have whatever customer base he wants to have. But on the other hand, it's this relentless politicization of everything. I don't want to do this. I don't want to go down this road. I love Penzeys Spices. But now I don't buy them anymore. I'm sorry, Greg. This is part of what you're talking about, isn't it?
Yeah, we're a long way from Michael Jordan saying Republicans buy sneakers too. It used to be that when you'd start a private corporation or a business, it was all about making sure that you had your eyes on the bottom line. I think it's interesting that we've seen over the course of the last, I think 5, 6, 7 years or so, like the whole Jack Phillips controversy, where when it comes to the left, our side needs to serve everyone. You cannot deny service to anyone. But then here on the left, they're happy to deny service to anyone who is a conservative or anyone who supports the president of the United States. It just, not only is it kind of like mind-boggling, but the rank hypocrisy that we're seeing on the other side of the aisle is something that really needs to be addressed too, and needs to be called out.
Well, yeah, and it doesn't end well in the end, and nothing good is served by. It's not just refusing service, but if you have a cabinet official you don't like or a Supreme Court justice you don't like, and you start harassing them in public, that's a problem. A few people know that Kirstjen Nielsen, who was the Secretary of Homeland Security, she has disappeared. She is no. I don't know. I honestly have no idea what she was doing. For a while, I knew she had sort of left the whole national security world, Homeland Security world, had gone, I think, out to California, disappeared, which is not how we should run a country. Let me pull it back, Greg, for a minute.
Sure.
Because you have this piece in the Wall Street Journal recently, talking about your own background in this, and I'll be honest with you. And you and Greg, you and I have known each other. We're professional colleagues. I will tell you that there are people who they appreciate you coming out and being president of the New Tolerance campaign, but they're also sort of giving you a bit of a side eye.
Sure.
Well, okay, Greg admits that he was responsible for this. Why should we take him seriously? Now, I take you seriously because I think you're a serious person, but talk a little bit about the op-ed and about your culpability. Now, listen, and by the way, I think it's important. If you've made a mistake in terms of your advocacy and you think you've made a mistake, owning up to that is a good thing, and we should support people who are willing to. It's part of the New Tolerance campaign, Correct. Isn't it, Greg? So talk about that. Talk about your background in this and why you came to this epiphany about being part of the problem here and then becoming part of the solution.
Yeah, it's actually kind of a funny story. So I'll give you the genesis of that whole Wall Street Journal op-ed that ran last Wednesday. And I've been in my current role at the New Tolerance Campaign since May of 2021. So it's been a while.
Wow.
Yes, shortly after departing the White House, I had the opportunity to move into this role, and it's just something that fit.
And Greg, hold on. Let me just say, yeah. Time all blends together. So I could have sworn I've seen you since in all of this, but it may very well have been since before you went over to the New Tolerance Campaign. I'm sorry, you departed the White House, you go to the New Tolerance Campaign.
That's right. And but as I mentioned, the mission of the New Tolerance Campaign is to push back on wokeism and these CEOs that are involving themselves in these contentious cultural issues. And I was out for drinks with a friend of mine, and we were trying to pinpoint the moment where all of this started happening, right? Like, woke seems to have kind of like crept up on us. And it certainly, we don't have decades of history of corporations weighing in on issues. It's been, open for business means open for business to everyone for a very long time. And we thought back and we said, you know what? It's the gay stuff, isn't it?
Yeah.
Right? It was around like maybe 15 years or so ago, we saw corporations weighing in en masse on issues like same-sex marriage, on issues like people should not be fired from their jobs because they're gay. What I mentioned in the Wall Street Journal op-ed is that, I'm not a research analyst or anything. I don't know that was the moment where things got woke. But if it wasn't the moment, it was certainly the prime accelerant. It's when we started seeing rainbow logos everywhere in the month of June. It's when all these LGBTQ affinity groups started popping up around major corporations where, that's like declaring your sexuality in the office place. I mean, that's not something that had been accepted for a very long time. And here it is, being celebrated now in corporate America. And I will say, I don't regret any of the time or work I did at Log Cabin Republicans and the things we accomplished. But in terms of this strategy, it is something that I have hesitations about. So when when my buddy and I determined this, we said, wow, it was the gay stuff, wasn't it? And then, of course, I realized, wait a minute, I had something to do with this. I was actually part of the problem. And I immediately recalled a meeting that I had in the spring of 2013. It's the way I opened this Wall Street Journal piece. And I think it's instructive to your listeners. I was meeting with the head of government affairs for one of the major airlines in the United States and the chief lobbyist for one of the largest hotel chains in the United States. And it was to secure corporate support for what was called the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. And this would have made it illegal federally to terminate someone's employment because of their sexual orientation. And the strategy was, and the thinking was, that if corporations support Democrats and Republicans, financially through their PACs, et cetera, and if we can create a critical mass of corporations that weigh in on this issue, that could be just the pressure that is needed to move Republicans that we were trying to court on that legislation from a no to a maybe to a yes. And this major airline was already a supporter of the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. The chief lobbyist for this hotel chain shared that they actually, this is kind of interesting, they actually liked that there was no federal LGBT non-discrimination law. In fact, they loved doing business in states that did not have those protections at a state level. Why? Because the hotel chain had them as a matter of their employment policy for years and years and years, right? Like they didn't need a federal law or a state law.
Sure.
If you applied to work at this hotel chain, you would know that you would be welcome if you were gay. You will certainly not be terminated for that reason. And so the hotel chain thought that it put them at a competitive advantage. Here we are in these states, we actually have a broader access to a network of employees. It gives us a competitive edge in hiring. But this guy goes, he throws his arms up in the air and he goes, but, okay, yeah, you can count us in. You can count us in. And you know why? It's because they knew that if all these other corporations were supporting this legislation and they weren't, they'd stick out like a sore thumb, and it would be a PR nightmare for them. So they were actually happy to, well, not happy, but they reluctantly gave up a competitive advantage in business so that they wouldn't be the target of a woke mob. And that, in a nutshell, Andrew, is everything that is wrong with wokeism in America, right? Like, it is weighing in on contentious cultural issues. It is actually bad for business in many cases. It's something that doesn't directly impact their bottom line. In fact, it could have a negative impact on their bottom line. And then the last thing is, it sets a precedent where once corporations weigh in on something like the LGBT issues, they are going to be and have been asked to weigh on things like Black Lives Matter, critical race theory, abortion, so-called voting rights bills. So I just thought that moment, meeting with those two, government affairs individuals was very instructive and just opened my eyes to what's wrong about all this wokeism in corporate America.
Right. It is the well, I'm not going to say literal, but it is a great example of the so-called camel's nose under the tent, or the slippery slope. Right. You go here, and then where does it go? Now, it's funny because you talk about how it's sort of the gradualism. There are two ways to look at it. You can just kind of look at the gradual going down, then it drops off a cliff, or gradualism, then it rockets up high. Either way, I think you're right. It's called, it's the concept of critical mass. There's pressure that is put on over. And for the folks who are listening and not watching, I'm making a ball with my hands, and literally it's like a nuclear weapon. You press things together in pressure, and then eventually it explodes. And that's really what we're talking about here. So let's get into sort of the fundamentals. I mean, you're talking about it. Actually, let's talk a little bit about college campuses.
Sure. And
how this is playing out on college campuses, and in terms of the activism you guys are doing, the message that you're sending, all of this, the silencing of debate and dissent is fundamentally counter to what these academic institutions are supposed to stand for, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, when I talk about hypocrisy in institutions, you don't see greater hypocrisy in most cases than you do on college campuses. And, I think it's no secret, that there's been a leftward drift in the politics of higher education in the United States for, probably well over the last half century. I think we're more than 50 years here where, in the 1960s, when those institutions really started getting taken over by individuals who were far left students. But what has happened is that over the last 50 years, those people who were students in the 1960s and 70s are now the deans and the trustees of those universities. They are the faculty of those universities. And when people wonder why there's been this ever leftward drift in higher education, that's why. It's because those products of far leftism in the 1960s have matured, and instead of what's that apocryphal quote from Winston Churchill? If you're not liberal
when
you're young, you don't have a heart. But if you're not conservative when you're an adult, you don't have a brain.
Although you have no brains.
Well,
exactly.
They never got a brain, right? I mean, they were dyed-in-the-wool liberals, and that's what's happening at universities today.
We were warned about this in the movie in the early 90s, PCU, in which the president of that university says to two members of the board of trustees, now she's middle-aged, they're older, clearly well-heeled donors. She goes, well, I think we need a building. We need a building for the bisexual Asian studies department. But what are we going to cut? The math department or Latin? I say math. And they just look at her, they shake their heads. Anyway, there are so many things that I get reminded of here with this. But we need to have these kinds of discussions on campus, right? We need to, the only way, actually, let me ask you about this. As someone who was involved with conservative or Republican gay activism, I think you would agree with me that the only way that we could mainstream homosexuality in terms of society was to have an open and honest discussion about what our fears were and about what we supported, and it helped to alleviate fears in some way. And Obviously, there are other fears that people have that we can't talk about, we don't talk about, but we have to be able to talk about them in order to solve problems, don't we?
Yes, exactly. And when you talk about Grover Norquist and the whole Leave Us Alone coalition, I mean that's really what gay individuals were asking for. It wasn't about shoving our, at the time, so-called lifestyle down people's throats. It was really just about having the same rights and responsibilities as any other American does. But it took time. It took time to do that type of advocacy. And it's another point I make in the Journal article, and why I ultimately do regret the work that I did leaning on corporations to weigh in on social issues, is that I'm pretty confident that we would have marriage equality in all 50 states as a result of a Supreme Court ruling, whether or not 379 Fortune 500 companies sent amicus briefs to the Supreme Court demanding that they do that.
Sure.
And that bill that I was lobbying for at the time, the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, it has not become law. It passed in the Senate, but continues to stall in the House, Congress after Congress. But look what's happened over the course of the last 10 years since I was in that fateful day. I was in the office of that airline's head of government affairs. We have organically created, through market forces, a society and a culture where over 90% of Americans think it's wrong to terminate someone from their employment because they're gay. And this is like, the other part of things. Like, legislation is not the solution in every case to our societal woes. If we actually do work creating genuine tolerance around the country, we can actually solve our own problems.
I want to go back to this academic issue because I remembered what it was that I wanted to say. You talk about sort of the skewed perspective within academia. An organization, I support it financially. My alma mater, the Global Research Institute at William and Mary, they do an annual survey of international relations academics, professors who teach international relations, a survey of the greatest threats that are facing the globe from an international relations perspective. And you talk about out of touch, right? I mean, I think we can say Russia invading Ukraine. I would probably put that up as the top existential threat. China following it. But for them, the number one threat is global warming.
Right.
And to me, this seems to be sort of, again, how these things sort of get skewed. This is not me dumping on Global Research Institute. They're the ones doing the research. They're just reporting what it is they found. But it's just sort of talking about, again, if we don't have these conversations, if academia skews far out of the mainstream. In fact, let me open this up to a whole other area. I'm sorry, Greg. Had a conversation recently, and I may have mentioned this when I talked to you on the air a couple of weeks ago. A good friend who's in PR, talking about it sort of has just left a PR job and incredibly frustrated because she believes that PR firms are giving big corporations bad advice when it comes to these very thorny political issues, encouraging them to weigh in when they shouldn't. I would think you would agree with this. Are corporations getting bad advice from Gen Z PR people who have been so skewed in terms of their reality and how to approach these things?
Yeah, I mean, it's not just Gen Z. I don't think that they're entirely to blame for this, but there.
Oh no, I blame them all. I blame Gen Z for everything. But go ahead. I'm sorry. Yeah.
How convenient, it's interesting if you look at polling on these issues. There have been surveys that have been done of CEOs around the country. And there was a survey that came out in November of last year, so fairly recent, where 63% of CEOs felt it was their duty to weigh in on social issues. It was their obligation as executive leaders and captains of industry to use their platform and the business to weigh in on these issues. The Wall Street Journal, a week before my op-ed ran, did their own poll. What's wild is the number was the same, but it was exactly mirrored. The Wall Street Journal poll found 63% of Americans felt CEOs and corporations should not weigh in on contentious cultural issues at all. So what does that tell me? There's this total ivory tower disconnect that's happening right now in boardrooms and executive offices around the United States, where these CEOs are being told by a bunch of yes men in the boardroom, attaboy, attagirl, yeah, this is exactly what we need to do. You're doing a great job. And told by their PR teams and being told by their marketing teams that these are good ideas. And a lot, for a very long time, there was never any pushback from our side. There was pushback, but in the sense that, corporations could get away with doing this, knowing that, at worst, there would be a sternly worded op-ed in the National Review, and maybe Sean Hannity would do an opening monologue about this, but it would all blow over within 24 to 48 hours. And, much like that head of that hotel chain, they would know that, if they did not pursue this line of marketing, the left, they might earn the ire of the left. So that's what we're doing right now at the New Tolerance campaign, is making sure that these CEOs in these ivory towers hear it from their consumers, making sure that the deans of these universities hear it, not just from everyday Americans, but from alumni and donors at these universities, that the support that they think they have is actually not there at all.
It's good you bring that up, because again, I use an example. We talk about it quite a bit in my household and among my circle. Again, I wear it literally. I don't wear it literally like a lapel, like a pin on my lapel, but I have. Maybe I should get a pin for it. I went to William and Mary, and I love it. I bleed. I breathe and bleed. Green and gold, which is their colors. And back in 2005. They had a president who had been a very well-heeled, very well-connected Democratic person. And when he came on as president of the university, they said, please, and he promised he would leave his politics at the schoolhouse gate. But he came in and immediately started doing things, not the least of which was he removed an historic cross from the chapel that was on the college campus. It was a cross that had been given to the college from the nation's oldest Episcopal church, Bruton Parish Church in Williamsburg, Virginia. And he had removed it quietly one weekend, like before homecoming. And it was discovered. And he did not count on the fact that there were a lot of conservative alumni, well-connected conservative alumni, well-networked conservative alumni who pushed back and got that cross returned. That's the message of the New Tolerance campaign, putting people in connection with these CEOs and these heads of these universities so that they know. It's essentially doing what we all were able to do at William & Mary. Eventually, Nickel did not get his contract renewed. This is what you're trying to make for these corporations.
Yeah, 100%. And hey, just to be clear, I have nothing against the National Review or Sean Hannity.
Oh, sure.
I think they both do great work. But the idea in starting the New Tolerance campaign was that when people read that op-ed or they watch that opening monologue from Laura Ingraham or Sean Hannity and get fired up, sure. What can you do? You're just one person. What can you do except shake your fist at the sky? It doesn't matter if American Express is pushing racial quotas in their hiring process at that company. You could cut your credit card up today and put it on social media, and American Express won't care. But if people know that there are others like them that are able to raise their voices together and send a message, and not just into the abyss, but actually send it directly to the CEOs and the boards of directors of these corporations that they disagree with, well, then all of a sudden they have a sense of agency, right? And so, I think our side has been very good at intellectualizing all of this. We know there's a problem, and we certainly know that something has to change, but the grassroots component has been missing from all of this. And I realize, there's people on our side who, have maybe thought that this type of activism is a little gauche. It's like, oh my gosh, we're gonna gang up on private corporations now and tell them what they can and cannot do. Well, let me tell you, the left has been doing this for decades, and they not only do they not care, they love the fact that the right doesn't want to do this type of stuff. And so I think we've reached a point where we need to fight fire with fire, and we're actually seeing results here. And the goal is not to push corporations and make them conservative. It's to push them to a place of neutrality. And so I think if we can rally those types of voices through NTC to help do that and be the grassroots component there, we can get to that place.
You're telling the corporations it's okay to not get involved in politics. In fact, that's what we want. We just want to be able to go and buy our beer or our ketchup or our spices or whatever, our waffles, without having to get a lecture about the politics. Greg, let me. I always do this, and actually I didn't. Normally I warn you about these things, and I didn't this time. I apologize.
All right.
So, and I will explain it to you. I had at one point been conceiving of an entire podcast where I talked to political and policy people about nothing about politics, about merely their outside interests. What they're doing outside of their professional work. Because I think it's important to people understand that we all have lives outside of what it is that we're doing on the air or with our political work. So tell us a little bit about your outside interests when you're not engaging in the work of the New Tolerance campaign. And I know you're going to say it's a 24-hour job. I'm always doing. I know that's. So what are you doing when you're not working? How do you relax? How do you spend your downtime? What helps otherwise fill your soul?
Yeah, we all have to unwind a little bit, right? Even the people that say
Yes.
they're workaholics. Number one, getting out of the swamp is something that recharges me a lot. And I can tell you that my partner and I, throughout the pandemic, made several trips out to West Virginia, and I've just fallen in love with it. So
nice.
We've been out to Shepherdstown. We've been out to a number of places. Just the hiking, the fresh air. Horseback riding, all of that stuff is just something that helps to relax me. People might not realize this or assume this about me, but I love video games. I absolutely love.
Right.
I absolutely
Wow.
love video games. When I was 4 years old, now I can date myself. When I was 4 years old, my grandmother bought an Atari for. Wow. Both of her kids, my parents and then my aunts and her family, and for herself and my grandfather. I mean, those were very expensive. I think they were $400 at the time. This was like 1981. So think
Sure.
about that and do the math on inflation. But my father loved and loves video games. I was basically raised on them, and I have a PlayStation 5 right over here, and so kind of escaping from politics and the swamp, virtually is something that I do as well.
That's great, and I'll tell you, we also went to West Virginia during the pandemic and fell in love with that. Spent some time in the New River Gorge, hiking around and finding waterfalls, which was so much fun for us. And I made the trip to Shepherdstown this past January, which was a good time. Greg, how do folks find out more about the New Tolerance campaign?
Sure thing. Go to our website, newtolerance.org. You can find us on Twitter at @new_tolerance, or on Facebook, just search for New Tolerance Campaign. And if folks are interested, my personal Twitter handle is @Gregory T. Angelo.
Yeah, Gregory T. Angelo, Angelo. Gregory Angelo, thank you so very much for joining us today.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.
And as I said, check us out. If you're watching us, check out our podcasts on every major podcast platform. If you're listening, you want to watch some of this again, come back and watch us on YouTube. We drop these episodes every week on a Monday. This has been yet another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I'm your host, Andrew Langer. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.